Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to welcome you today to the ASLS Briefinar on the Russian History Foundation with Michael Perekrestov. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. I just wanted to let you know that you will be muted for this just to cut down on background noise. And we're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. So if you need to grab a drink or reposition yourself, now would be a great time. If you have any questions or issues, you can just pop them in the question tab. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Russian History Foundation ASLS Briefinar today. We're going to get started just about now, get Michael and Ryan's web cameras on. I'm Becky, the manager of professional development at NILA, sorry. If you have any questions today, we're gonna answer them at the end, so you can pop them in the questions tab. Also, if you have any technical trouble, you can pop that in there. We are gonna be recording the webinar, so you can view that at a later date. And now without further ado, to keep it brief, I'll hand it over to Ryan and Michael.
Services. Sure. So for this question, I prepared some slides because I think taking a look at the spaces and some of the objects will give you a better idea of what I'm referring to. So Ryan, tell me if anything's malfunctioning. But
looks great.
All right. So this is the site where I work. This is Holy Trinity Monastery. At first glance, you might think that it's Russia, but this is located not far from Cooperstown. It's about halfway between Albany and Syracuse. So the monastery was founded in 1930 by Russian emigres who were fleeing religious and political persecution in the Soviet Union. And so I think one of the characteristics, the unique characteristics of our collection is that on the sort of foundation side of things, there are so many objects that have several stories. They're not just containers of information, but the fate of these objects, the fate of these materials coming from Russia after the Second World War or after the Revolution really makes for a unique collection. So just to kind of define, I kind of group it into two sections. There's the Holy Trinity Seminary side of the collection, which is more to support the curriculum and more contemporary materials. And then there's the foundation side of things, which is more aimed at the preservation of materials that were published in Russian, Imperial Russia and the Russian diaspora. So I'm going to run through a couple of images for you just to get a sense of where we are and some of the objects that we have. So this is the interior of the church. All of this was done by the monks who lived here. This is the cemetery church. There's lots of Russian emigres who were buried at the cemetery in the monastery. This is the museum as it was from 1984 until 2014. And so I was privileged to be part of the redesign process for the museum. So this is what it looks like right now. we had a professional designer come in and do the upgrade. So here's another image of that. And then I chose a couple of images of some things that we have in the library collection. This is one of the oldest printed books in Russia, printed in Russia. It's from 1575, Book of Gospels. It was printed by one of the first printers in Russia. This is a set of books that, as you can see from the book plate, belonged to Nicholas II, the last Tsar in Russia. This is a presentation copy of a particular book that has an original watercolor incorporated into it, and we had it recently restored. It's now on display. I wish I could have time to talk about all of the intricacies of the conservation work that was done here, but this was a presentation copy to Alexander III of Russia, the Tsar. This is a really cool piece that I cataloged recently. It's an atlas from the late 1700s. It was looted by Napoleon's soldiers in 1812 when they were invading Russia, and then ended up in France, then were confiscated by the Germans, and then the train that was carrying it was bombed, and this thing ended up with some Russian emigres and ended up in the US eventually. It's interesting that there's an original drawing on the back that is attributed to one of the artists who was working during Napoleon's time. So this is from the archival side of things. This is a expense ledger that belongs to one of the daughters of Nicholas II, and it has the last invoice is for a haircut, which they had to get because they had measles, and so their hair was falling out. So cool archival documents. This is from the museum collection. This is a pearl earring that belonged to Empress Alexandra, the wife of Nicholas II. It was found during the investigation of the imperial family's murder in 1918. These are some fantastic jeweled pendants worn by clergy in Imperial Russia, and these are on display in our current exhibition. You might see that I have an underlying agenda, which is for you to come and visit. This is a fantastic embroidery that's also on display here. An icon, this is all silver filigree. This was also recently conserved, and an icon that is actually from a private collector in the Albany area, and an Easter egg that's intricately painted. So I wish I had more time to show you more of this, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a feeling for what the collection is all about, how many interesting pieces there are. And as I said, there's two stories. There's the first, which is the history of their creation in Imperial Russia, and then there's the second part of how they got here to the United States.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you guys have such a collection in kind of a pretty rural area of upstate New York. It's very unexpected. When I first came and saw your site, I was pretty blown away. So all of you should make it out there at some point, and especially see their current exhibition. It's really I think I might have seen it right when it was going up or something. But yeah, thank you. And so the next question leads further into that. So with such an interesting collection and having such an interesting position, what types of users, who's your main clientele for using these materials?
Sure. I kind of split them up into two large categories, because there's those who are interested in the more scholarly aspects of the materials. So those would be researchers coming from the outside. There would be students from the seminary. We have both a bachelor's and a master's program. We have faculty. We have professors who visit and use our resources, because there's a lot of material that isn't available locally or even nationally, because major institutions weren't interested in collecting these things, especially as it pertains to the Russian history of the Russian diaspora. So for instance, a college professor from Vassar has been coming year in year out to work with a certain periodical that we have in our collection, because I don't believe it's held anywhere else. And then there's the second large category of clientele, which would probably, it's kind of the general public, the people who would visit the museum more to just get a better understanding of what the museum's all about, to learn about Russian history, Russian culture, and how all of that relates to local history, how this ended up here in New York State, in Jordanville with population of 900, how it ties into world history and the history of immigration. So, and then, I'm sure that everybody who works in libraries gets interesting inquiries once in a while. Probably the most interesting one that I received recently was, my great-grandfather was a wood carver, and he worked for this guy on an estate that was on an island. Can you tell me what his name was? So, you got you have to, some of the requests would require a lot more information for me to answer them correctly. So,
and then you also have the students in the seminary. What's the student population, or about how many students do you have enrolled?
Sure, it's quite small. So we have about 30 students on site, 30 to 40 on site, and then we also have a correspondence program. So there are people who are studying online. So some requests might come in from them, especially through interlibrary loan. Can you get me an article, and so on.
Yeah. Wow. Great. And this next question will definitely be before COVID, after COVID kind of question. But what kinds of outreach and partnerships are you working on currently?
Well, we've had several types of partnerships that have, I think that partnerships are great because you can always share resources. You can always achieve more in partnership with other institutions or other people than you can by yourself. So I I mentioned that we're sort of like a startup, and there's a lot of, I should mention that this kind of level of professional attitude towards the collection is something of a more recent phenomenon. So there's a lot of just trying to get a sense of what we have and to process it and to make it accessible to researchers or to anybody who's interested in this. So one of the big partnerships that we had, and this was a while ago, not so recent, but something that's worth mentioning, is there was an NEH grant that we received along with the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and through them we were able to process a number of our archival collections, and they were microfilmed. So there are microfilms now here as well as at Stanford and in some Russian institutions as well. So that's an example of something we've done to in partnership with another institution to get our collections better accessible. From the museum side of things, we've been engaged in loaning pieces from our collection. So obviously not everybody's going to make the trip out to wonderful Jordanville, New York, and we understand that. So in addition to having exhibitions here on site, we also lend pieces out nationally and internationally. So on the national side of things, we've lent pieces to Washington. There's a wonderful museum called the Hillwood Museum that has a large Russian collection. They had a Fabergé show, so we showed some of our pieces there. There's the Museum of Russian Icons up in Clinton, Massachusetts, which has pieces from our collection in their current exhibition. The Museum of Russian Art in Minneapolis. And then recently there's been kind of an increased interest in our collection internationally as well. So I traveled several times to Europe accompanying loans there. One exhibition was in Moscow in a museum that's right next to the Kremlin. And then there was one in Frankfurt at the Museum of Russian Icons in Frankfurt. And then the most recent one was at the Science Museum in London, which gets 3 million visitors a year. And they did an exhibition on the Imperial family and sort of looking at them from the perspective of science, talking about illnesses that plague the family, the investigation that took place to identify the remains after they were killed. And so we lent over 20 objects to that exhibition, and it's really interesting to see our institution listed with the British, the British Library and the Kremlin museums and the State Archive of the Russian Federation and all of these fantastic, huge institutions that are participating in these projects, and then our little museum here in Jordanville. So that's a great way for us to share these objects. And then lastly, I also should mention that we've launched an online lecture series called Second Saturdays. So obviously that's on the second Saturday of every month. We've already had 2 lectures, quite successful, and people, it's a silver lining for us because obviously the museum was closed, and this is a way for us to reach out to various audiences all over North America, but also from the UK, Saudi Arabia, New Zealand, Namibia, Hungary, Russia. Those are places where people registered from and actually attended. So despite the time difference, so that's great.
So in all these, raise your profile considerably, especially, having your objects be sought after, and that's great. I mean, I think the one of the biggest challenges for an archive and for a museum is just getting people seeing and appreciating your materials. You don't want them sitting in a back room somewhere. So that's
Right.
great to hear you've had that kind of impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one of the challenges right now that I see is just advertising what we have to the local population or people visiting, because people in Moscow and Frankfurt and London know about our existence, but people down the road in Richfield Springs or Herkimer don't even know that we're in existence. So it's and we're I believe that we could be one of the top regional museums in this area, and that's one of the things that I'd like to do more of, is work with other institutions in the area to promote that.
Especially being so close to Cooperstown, you can kind of
exactly.
draw some of that traffic up as they're going back to the thruway, stop by Jordanville. Great. So you had shown some pictures earlier of how the museum space changed, but is there anything else that has changed or practices, et cetera, since you started working there? And kind of as an extension of that, are there other changes that you're hoping to see in the future, or other big things you're working on?
Sure. I think that one of the biggest things and something that needs to be noted is a change in culture and the way that the materials and the collections are perceived, because initially, because of the way that the museum and the archives and the library were created, it was mostly for Russian emigres by Russian emigres. It was for a specific community. It was for a specific sort of ethnic community of people either in this area or people visiting the monastery. But I think over the past 15, 20 years, there's been a marked change in attitude towards what these things really are and their value, not just to the immediate community that collected them, but for people at large. So for me, it's really gratifying to see the change in the museum being open to anybody who is interested in visiting. We're open 6 days a week. We have regular visiting hours, which wasn't the case for several decades. We are really intent on sharing these pieces, whether it's here in Jordanville or it's overseas or online or in other venues throughout the country. So I think that that's something that's super gratifying for me, because that's what really I'm passionate about. I get to work with these wonderful things, and it's sort of like a gold mine. You never know what the next box is going to reveal. So just this change in culture and attitude towards with an attitude towards sharing with the public is wonderful to see, and that's guiding everything that we're doing right now. In terms of what I'd like to see in the future, quite honestly, just more staff and more funding towards various projects so that we can get more of the collections processed, because it's a little bit daunting to see how much there's still to do. We have about 50,000 cataloged volumes in the library, and the emphasis on catalog, because there's a huge backlog of things, which, I'm sure that there's plenty of jewels and gems that will be revealed as we go through them. That piece that I showed you with the ebony frontispiece that was found in one of the boxes that I was processing, and it's just amazing to see these things, and you want to share them. I think now with the website going up, we want to launch a blog, we want to do more social media outreach, we want to do more videos. So I think what I'd like to see more of in the future is both on the internal side to catalog things and make them accessible to researchers and people who have a scholarly interest, and then on the other side of things to do more of the promotion and just to share these things on a more popular level with a more general audience.
That's awesome. And, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that I work with Michael some with New York Heritage Materials. So the other thing is, if you're interested and want to see more, there's one collection up currently that has a lot of photographs of the process of building the seminary and kind of the early days of the site in Jordanville. So definitely encourage everybody to check those out. Yeah, and it's great. You know, the pandemic in a lot of ways has been a big burden, but then it also opens you up to working on kind of thinking outside of the box and, you know, bringing lecture series online and kind of reaching and sharing your materials in a different way. So it's great to hear that you're.
Well, it's also interesting to sort of level the playing field because, you know, we have the same restrictions as other larger museums, and so we have the same kind of opportunities in a way. So it's quite an interesting time to be working, and you have to pivot quickly and figure out how to best serve your audience.
It's a great way to think of it. You know, the small guys are just as in it as the big guys, and you know, in terms of your, you know, you're only limited by the hours in your day and the number of hats you're wearing, and
right.
Yeah, that's great. We have a few minutes at the end here, so Becky, if there are any questions.